Can you explain to me why you became a Christian? And as one, what do you believe that is different from more mainstream Protestant Christianity? For example, the Trinity, what happens to the soul after death, the scientific and historical accuracy of the Bible, when to tell if it's being literal or metaphorical, etc. I was raised in the Christadelphian community, a small Christian sect of the Restorationist movement, which emerged during the mid-19th century and which has theological roots in Renaissance-era Unitarianism. That's not Unitarian Universalism, by the way. I experienced two major crises of faith, one in my late teens, one in my early 20s, both of which I resolved through increasing abandonment of the conservative Christian teachings I had learned, and by taking a more academically oriented and critical view of theology. Christadelphian doctrine rejects traditional Christian teachings such as the Trinity, the immortal soul, going to heaven or hell at death, substitutionary interpretations of the death of Christ, and all forms of supernatural evil, such as demons and the traditional devil or Satan. Since our community has no hierarchical structure or even central organization, consisting instead of numerous totally independent congregations which organize themselves and whose members take turns to perform roles and duties and make congregational decisions through a combination of volunteering and voting, there's also quite a broad spectrum of beliefs and practices, from the conservative to the radical, across the entire community as a whole. Although we do have a core group of shared doctrines, and overall I would say the community generally leans conservative. I am considered a radical by most and merely a progressive by some. However, it should be noted that most Christadelphians are fairly socially conservative and would not describe themselves as anarchists, and many of them ironically oppose socialism, or at least, and this is more to the point really, what they think socialism is. This is largely a product of our community being quite strongly influenced in England and America by the rise of Bolshevism in the early 20th century, and later by the Cold War, since in our community, socialism was identified with communism, and communism was identified with atheism. And that was pretty natural, since the Bolshevists did sell communism with atheism, and during the Cold War, the USSR itself did sell communism with atheism. Nevertheless, our community has always been very active in establishing and contributing to social welfare organizations and charities of various kinds, both in our home countries and overseas. When it comes to biblical interpretation, ironically, our 19th century founders and early expositors tended to be far more academic and critical interpreters of the Bible than our mid to late 20th century members, and they were very well informed on the latest secular academic biblical studies, which they followed keenly. Those early 19th century to early 20th century expositors of ours regarded science and the Bible as harmonious rather than in conflict, believing that any interpretation of the Bible should give way to well-established scientific and archaeological discoveries. And they thought it was very important to use tools such as lexical and socio-cultural analysis, source criticism, textual criticism, and form criticism, which are secular methods of interpreting the Bible, in order to differentiate between literal and figurative passages. Consequently, they believed in a very old earth and rejected young earth creationism and some of the more fundamentalist beliefs, and they held what would be considered today quite progressive views on science and scripture. Although our early community was originally hostile to theories such as evolution, by the early 20th century, the gradual accumulation of scientific progress started to convince some of our leading commentators that we had to start giving ground on this subject and adjust our interpretation of scripture accordingly. Some very definite steps were made in this direction in our community before the First World War, but unfortunately there was a kind of conservative backlash after the war, and our community retreated firmly to its original anti-evolution position. Although a bit more progress was made up to the mid-20th century, after the Second World War, there was another conservative backlash, influenced strongly by the general social conservatism of the 1950s, and then yet another rise in conservatism in reaction to the tumultuous events of the 60s, during which our community started to see even more conservative positions on doctrine take hold, and young earth creationism gained ground among many congregations, which was quite honestly extraordinary, since previously young earth creationism had been consistently rejected by our community, or at least had occupied only a tiny fringe. The original approach of our community to biblical hermeneutics, and in particular the differentiation between literal and figurative, and the approach to science, is still found in our community, though large sections of our community have been taken over by the fundamentalist revival of the mid to late 20th century. Returning to an issue I raised earlier in my discussion of Charlie Kirk, the Christadelphians are a Christian anarchist sect which has always been opposed to violence without being prescriptive pacifists, since we belong to the historic Christian peace church tradition. In fact, we were first registered with the US government during the Civil War, which was a step made necessary in order to receive religious exemption from military service. In the First World War, one of our members became the legal test case for granting our sect conscientious objection to military service in Canada, refusing to serve despite being placed in military prison and abused in various ways. In Australia, the UK, and New Zealand during the First World War, our members refused conscription and had to negotiate the consequences with the government. In World War II, we went through the same process, only it was much worse for our German members, some of whom were placed in insane asylums for refusing to serve, and one of our members was not only imprisoned, but actually also executed when they refused conscription. During the Vietnam War, our American and Australian members went through the same process, with our Australian members in particular being scrutinised by state courts to determine whether their behaviour in their personal and professional lives reflected the Christian values they claimed to uphold. Otherwise, they wouldn't be granted conscientious objection to military service. Prior to and during World War II, our community was involved in the Kindertransport, a British operation transporting Jewish children from Europe to Britain in response to Nazi persecution. Many such children were fostered by Christadelphian families in Britain, and we established 2 hostels for Jewish children, one in Birmingham and one in Rugby. We had strong connections with the local Jewish communities in the UK and ensured that Jewish children fostered by Christadelphians maintained their ethnic and religious identity and were not in any way compelled or coerced to adopt or participate in Christianity. Our work in the Kindertransport has been recognised by a number of Jewish groups in the UK, as well as by many of the Jewish people our members fostered and supported. Various books and articles have been written on this. As basically Christian anarchists, we have always maintained a strong insistence on the complete separation of church and state, refusing to become involved in political activity, including voting or political lobbying, and refusing to serve in any government office, including the police and even fire brigade. In 1913, our community actually received a favourable mention in an anarcho-communist journal in an article condemning the way mainstream Christian sects had made peace with the state. The author, an atheist, wrote that there were hardly any Christian groups left who refused to compromise with the state, identifying us as one of the few remaining exceptions. I personally came to identify consciously with anarchism quite early due to my rather unusual upbringing. My father was born in Germany to a British soldier, a member of the artillery, and a German mother who had been a member of the Hitler Youth and was still a devout Nazi even after the war ended. As for how those two got together, well, frankly, it was a marriage of convenience. For my father's mother, this was her 3rd husband, the first 2 having been German and killed during the war. And after the war, well, she just needed a way to stay alive and feed herself. As to what his father was thinking, I really have no clue at all. My father's mother's attempts to indoctrinate my father into Nazism were useless, since living in the wreckage of Germany, he couldn't see any benefit to what the Nazis had done, even though, as a child, he was still uninformed about the regime's numerous crimes against humanity. In fact, he wouldn't even be taught about this in his British education when they moved to the UK, and found out about most of it only after he moved to Australia. So eventually his parents moved from Germany to the UK, and after being raised and schooled there, when my father was 19, he immigrated to Australia, cutting his family off completely, having absolutely nothing to do with them ever after. Because by this time, what he had learned about Germany made him want to completely disassociate himself from the nation and from his German ancestry. He came over to Australia on a British passport, and he had come to hate his Nazi mother. I know virtually nothing else about his family because he never spoke about them to me at all. In fact, as far as he was concerned, they ceased to exist after he left the UK. The very little I do know about them was told to me by my mother, who heard it from him. In Australia, my father became a member of the Australian Communist Party, which is why when I grew up, our family bookshelf included the works of writers such as Nietzsche, Hegel, Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and Zhukov. That's the famous Russian general of World War II, all of which I read, though I have to say I never finished Hegel since I found him pretty incomprehensible. I honestly don't think I would have much of a better chance at understanding him even now. I found Zhukov the most entertaining since his memoirs were basically about the war from his perspective, and of course that was fascinating to me. We also had Hitler's Mein Kampf on the shelf, and I read that too. Our copy was heavily annotated with my father's handwritten notes in the page margins because he couldn't refrain from having furious arguments with Hitler, telling him why he was wrong and calling him all kinds of names. My father eventually became disillusioned with the Soviet Union due to events such as the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and he left the Australian Communist Party, though he still maintained his socialist views.